The things that hemp, industrial hemp, becomes decriminalized under Washington state law because the term marijuana under the Washington State Uniform Controlled Substances Act will be redefined so that the word marijuana will no longer apply to any cannabis strain that has less than or equal to 0.3% of active THC in it. That is the standard that's been adopted by other countries that produce industrial hemp that we import because we can't grow it domestically. So those are kind of the big, broad brush pieces of Initiative 502, and I look forward to talking more about the details as we go on.
I think so.
These things are just live, I guess. This thing is feeding back. You guys hear me out there? All right. I'm here to talk about 502 and about other aspects of legalization, but the first thing that I want to say about 502 is it's not legalization. It is flat out not legalization. It does not legalize anything at all. What it does is it creates a very, very, very narrow exception that allows you to possess an ounce, and then it comes up with this rulemaking progress where the Liquor Control Board, undoubtedly being rewarded for its expertise in hemp and hemp issues, will be drafting rules about something that they know nothing about. This means that you will get administration essentially done by bureaucrats. It won't even be done by politicians in the context of the legislature where you can threaten them with withholding your vote. You will have zero impact despite any public hearings they may hold. Some of you may remember the public hearings we held on amounts of marijuana for medical patients after 6032 passed. You can remember that success and anticipate similar successes with this process. The other thing that 502 does, which wasn't mentioned here, is it makes some extremely disastrous changes to the DUI laws in this state. These changes are unasked for, they're unneeded, they're unjust, they're unscientific, and there's no way in hell anybody should vote for these being applied to folks in this state. For kids ages 16 to 21, the bad news is it's a zero tolerance standard. Everybody get that? That's zero tolerance. I thought that Nancy Reagan's time had passed and that the phraseology of zero tolerance politics was over, but I can tell you one thing, I myself have zero tolerance for zero tolerance policies. There is no reason that kids 16 to 21, and believe me, this will fall most disproportionately on kids of color, and we all know that. We're kidding ourselves if we think otherwise. There may be a black president, but racism is alive and well in this country, and it's still a powerful motivating force in law enforcement. The standard for adults will be 5 nanograms, which is a standard that's been rejected 3 times by the Colorado State Legislature and by doctors, lawyers, and researchers and everyone else. The 5 nanogram standard that's put out there for adults has no scientific basis. I believe there's no justification for it. The bad thing about both of those standards is the other change that's been made to the law as these turn into strict liability laws, per se laws, which means that we cannot defend you. They take away your ability to have a defense. Once you test at the limit, it's done. You're a kid, anything, you're done. You're an adult, 5 or better, patient or not, I cannot defend you, you're done. That is not what America's about. That's not what impairment's about. That's not what sober driving's about. None of those issues are implicated in this. It's a new penalty for pot for kids, and it's an unscientific standard for adults. We'll talk some more.
Can everyone hear me? Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm Pete Holmes. As the MC said, I'm your city attorney. I ran for office in 2009, and marijuana possession was one of the big issues on the campaign trail. And I made a promise on the campaign trail simply to no longer prosecute possession cases if I were elected. And I dismissed all of the cases that were pending the first week I took office, and we've not filed another one since. Arrests are continuing. Arrests are continuing. That's what you've got to hear. And if you're outside the city limits, you don't have a city attorney or a county prosecutor who will not prosecute you for that arrest. And I think we all need to be really calm and quiet and let that sink in for a minute. People are being arrested at the rate of 10,000 a year in this state. And they're doing time, and they're doing really hard time. It's fortunate for the people in Seattle that they have a prosecutor who's exercising discretion not to prosecute. I won't be city attorney forever. And it's important that we change the law. We can't decree a change in the law. I can say we're not going to prosecute, but no one person, not Douglas, not Jeff, not Alison, not me, can make a statement and say that shall be the law from henceforth. We have a democratic process, and it takes time to make change. Everyone in this room knows how long, how hard the battle has been. We have one ballot measure in Washington State this year, and one only. It's not a choice between two. You have one opportunity to vote to advance the cause of legalization, of taking a full frontal assault on federal prohibition, which is our common enemy. And that's Initiative 502. It's happening in 2 other states at the same time. And it's important that we help pass all 3 measures. All 3 will send an important statement to Washington, D.C. that the people have a better idea that prohibition has failed. The only thing you have achieved is to fill our jails, make us the #1 jailer nation on the planet. You have enriched violent criminal cartels, and you have deprived local governments of revenue. You've deprived local agricultural industry of a source of income, and it's just wrong. 502 is not perfect, but it represents a strong statement that the voters can understand. It's wrong for the government to tell private adults what to do in private. If they're not harming someone. If it's not a public safety issue, the government has no business criminalizing adult behavior. The government does have a responsibility to keep people safe. And 502 tries to draw that distinction. It tries to provide a legal, safe place for adults to buy marijuana, and it tries to reassure a skeptical public that you will not be harmed with stone driving or youth that are using marijuana too soon. That's what 502 is trying to strike, and that's the option that we have to advance the ball in November, to vote yes on 502 and move this ball much further down the road. So that's all I want to say for right now, except that I do want you to remember that silence that we had at the very beginning. This is popular in Seattle to talk about legalization, and we can all sit here and we can be pretty smug that we're in a bunch of a room of like-minded people. But we have a chance that this is going to go backwards, guys. And if you think it's easy for me just because I'm the city attorney in Seattle, that I haven't gotten a load of shit for saying we're not going to prosecute people, you are naive beyond belief. So keep this in mind. We have got to make real change in the law, and that's what 502 is trying to achieve. Thank you.
So, looking over the questions that you... Am I invisible? Oh, gosh. And they said more Jeff, is what all these note cards say.
Does this work? Yeah. Okay. All right. They said that this was billed as a legalization panel, but really it's kind of a debate since everybody knows that 2 of us support I-502 and 2 of us oppose it. This is very hard for me because I've been a legalizer for over 40 years. Allison's a dear friend. We used to work together. We parted good friends. I don't like to criticize her. Pete Holmes, best city attorney we ever had. I voted for him early and often, and I will again. I don't like to disagree with them. And I'm taking a lot of shit from my friends on the NORML Board of Directors because I've dissented from NORML's position about this. But
thank you,
thank you. Dissent I must, and the reason I must dissent is that I just don't think this will work. And that comes from my experience, 44, 45 years of meeting the people who are getting busted every day. I meet them, you know, sometimes 5, 6, 7 a week over 44 years. I see what happens, and I see what happens to them. And I once said, you know, this is it, and I said it maybe cruelly, and maybe I didn't mean to criticize. I said, this I-502 is what happens when people that don't really understand the criminal justice system tinker around with it. Now that's kind of insulting. I didn't mean it as an insult. What I really mean is, they don't see what I see. But actually, Pete, on one occasion, kind of wised me up to how it really works. You know, I think when you took office, you said that there something like 80% of the pending pot cases were against minorities. Do I have that about right? 60% African American. Now that's not happening because the city attorney is a racist. It's not happening because the courts are racist. It's happening because where the rubber meets the road, where the decision to arrest somebody takes place, it's a police officer making that decision. And they make racist decisions. Remember, we got a pretty good police force, and yet this is the same police force where a guy who not long ago threatened to beat the Mexican piss out of somebody, he's still on the police force. So we got to realize what's going to happen in practical terms when this law goes into effect. Now, in my years of doing this, I was thinking back last night, I don't think I can think of even 2 or 3 misdemeanor cases that arose anywhere but in a car. In the car is where you get busted for misdemeanor pot, period. They don't come to your house. They don't come to your hotel unless you really fuck up. They get you in the car. Okay, so what's going to happen when this law passes? You're pulled over, the car smells of pot. Oh, officer, this ounce is all I got. I don't believe you. Get out of the car, get down in the mud, I'm going to get a dog and search your car. Well, then they search my car and they don't find anything else, but the car smells of pot. Maybe my tongue was green, because the next thing that happens is instead of getting a possession charge, which carries a mandatory day in jail, I get a DWI charge. And if I'm like most of you, I may not be impaired, but I'm sure as hell not going to get below 5 nanograms. So the burden of the criminal process is shifted from simple possession immediately to DWI. It's going to be the same people who get busted for possession, instead they'll be busted for DWI. Now that is how the criminal justice system works. That's how it works. To think otherwise is to indulge in fairy tales, I think. So, the other reason I don't think this is going to work, I told you, the DWI is going to be a problem. The legalization of an ounce isn't really going to save anybody from being busted. But the other thing that's wrong with this, in my opinion, is that no one's going to play. Now, we can debate this, but when you think about taxes, regressive taxes of 25% at each level of distribution. You know what a regressive tax is? That's a tax that impacts the poor more than the wealthy, like a sales tax. We got 75% compounded regressive taxes, plus anybody who wants to play in this game and be a manufacturer, a distributor, or a wholesaler is going to have to pay their federal taxes. Now, under Section 280E of the IRS code, when you're doing something that's illegal federally, you don't get to deduct anything, nothing, not the cost of the product you sold, not your taxes, not your rent, not your salaries. So you've got to pay taxes on your gross at every level, the grower, the wholesaler, and the retailer. Now, I just don't see how it's going to be possible to put pot on the table in front of a consumer for less than about 500 bucks an ounce. I don't see how it's going to be possible. So who is going to put their name on a list that must be turned over to the federal government? That same federal government has gone around the country shutting down dispensaries, even though they say they're not. That same federal government that when we had a medical bill that's very similar, said if you do this, you'll be subject to the full spectrum of civil and criminal prosecution by the feds. Who is going to put their name on a list that subjects you to, if you got any employees, if you got 4 employees, you start at 20 years under federal law. It's called a CCE. Who's going to put their name on a list for the right to sell state legal pot at twice the going market rate? That's why I don't think it will work. So I have to respectfully disagree. Based on my experience in the criminal justice system, I don't think it's going to work. If it would work, I'd say, well, maybe Seattle should take one for the movement. But it won't, and so we shouldn't.
So now that we have heard from everyone on our illustrious panel at least once, looking through the questions that you guys have submitted and following this online and talking to the people I know here, it seems that the most contentious issue is in regards to the driving and the DUID. And so I'm going to ask the same question 2 different ways, and I'm going to ask it to our pro side first. And so when I ask you guys, my question is, why would this be something that we would include in our own initiative? And what assurance can you give people that what we've just heard about the negative consequences of it, what would your response be to that?
I'll go first and I'll try to go really quickly. So the first, why would you include it? 2 reasons for that. First is when research was done around the failure of Proposition 19, there were panel-backed surveys, which meant voters were surveyed before they voted and then they were surveyed again after they voted. And one of the #1 reasons why soft yeses switched to no was because of fear of the drug driving. It was something that was hit on quite a bit by the California Highway Patrol, by Mothers Against Drunk Driving, by a number of people in the voter pamphlet. And so we took that information and then we tested the same issue here in Washington. We asked Washington voters whether they would be more or less likely to support legalization if it included something that operated like our .08 for alcohol. 62% said they'd be more likely to support, 11 said less likely, so that's a net increase of 51%. This is going to be a close vote. It's going to be somewhere in the low 50s. It might be 50% plus 1. We can't afford to lose a lot of mainstream voters who are not marijuana users, who don't understand how marijuana works, to fears about that. And so we included something. So then we went to the science and said, okay, if we're going to have to include something like this, this is going to be based on science. There are already 14 states that have THC per se laws. 11 of them are zero tolerance. Of those, half of them are zero tolerance even for the metabolites. 2 of them are 2 nanograms. 1 is 50 nanograms of inactive metabolites in urine. We said that doesn't sit with us. We too are zero tolerance on zero tolerance because it's not scientifically based. So with the 5 nanograms, and I'll talk about the kids because Douglas is confusing. Keep in mind that we have .02 for drivers under 21 when it comes to alcohol, not .08. Drivers who are under 21 are riskier drivers in general, and people know that. And if they don't want kids driving on any alcohol at all, they don't want them driving on marijuana at all either. So going back to the science, you can go to the website, our website, newapproachlaw.org. You can go to the FAQ page. You can find the backgrounder that lists what the science actually says about the connection between active THC and increased risk of involvement in an accident. Keep in mind that we are talking about active THC, which is the main psychoactive component that actually causes impairment, not the inactive metabolite, THC-COOH, or carboxy-THC, that can show up in your employment drug test days or even weeks after last use. They're very different, and the I-502 per se standard only applies to active THC. If you look at the science, it's available on our website. We cite the studies, we quote the studies. Not only does active THC drop down below 5 nanograms within 2 to 4 hours after last use when smoking, up to 8 hours after you eat it, because we all know that's a slower process, but 5 nanograms is the place where the peer-reviewed science at this point starts to see an increased risk of involvement in accident. So that is a reasonable starting place. I-502 dedicates funding to additional research by University of Washington and Washington State University to examine the relationship between active THC and impairment, including impaired driving, to see if we need to adjust that. Finally, you have to know how DUIs work right now in the state of Washington. Right now, 4% of all DUIs in this state are drug DUIs versus alcohol DUIs. There's about 20,000 DUIs in this state. So 4%, you're talking about 800 cases of drugged, and not all of those are marijuana, right? There's prescription opiates, there's methamphetamine, there's cocaine. So it's an even smaller number that are marijuana DUIs. The way a marijuana DUI is prosecuted right now, police officer has to have probable cause to arrest you, has to have impairment, has to have evidence that you've been driving impaired, can take you in for a breathalyzer, only if the breathalyzer doesn't indicate that your impairment is caused by alcohol can the police officer then take you in for a blood test to a medical professional. The police officer is not doing that blood test. That is all the law right now. The police officer is never going to know what your THC level is. There is no way for a police officer to profile you on the basis of your nanograms per milliliter because the police officer has no way of knowing. That blood test gets taken, it gets sent off to the Washington State Patrol Tox Lab, the police officer fills out the paperwork, sends the paperwork to the prosecutor's office, the prosecutor decides whether or not to charge you with a marijuana DUI. If they decide to charge you, they call up the Tox Lab, ask for that blood to be tested, the test comes back. What is amazing to me is that my good friends here who are criminal defense lawyers think that they have absolutely no ability to challenge a marijuana DUI, even with a per se standard, but there are plenty of DUI attorneys in this state that will take an alcohol DUI case, even if it's at 0.08 or higher. You know why? Because they can challenge whether or not the proper procedure was followed. They can challenge whether there was probable cause to arrest you in the first place. They can tell the jury, sure, they tell you it's a 0.08 test, but do you trust them? Do you believe them? Do you think that they followed all the procedures they were supposed to follow in the lab? None of that changes with the creation of a per se standard. With a 5 nanogram test, you're in the same place as you would be with a 0.08 on a BAC. So we're talking about a very small impact. And if we thought that all of a sudden all of the police officers in the state of Washington were going to go rogue and start arresting everybody that they thought was using marijuana and trying to charge them with DUI, we probably would have seen that in one of the 14 states that already has a THC per se law, especially those that have the zero tolerance. And we haven't seen that. Moreover, if you think this is actually going to have a practical impact on the cases that go to trial, you need to ask yourself this. How many adults are getting charged with marijuana DUI right now, having their blood tests come back at 5 nanograms or higher, and getting acquitted by the jury? Because that is the set of drivers that will actually practically be impacted by setting a 5 nanogram standard. And I'm here to tell you that what's happening right now is drivers with carboxy THC results are getting convicted. Drivers with less than 5 nanograms are getting convicted. There is a man in Washington State Prison right now who was involved in a vehicle accident, and his blood test came back at 1.6 nanograms, and he's serving time for vehicular homicide. So 5 nanograms actually gives the jury a tool to say, wait a second, if you're below 5 nanograms active THC, or you're just carboxy THC, maybe you weren't actually impaired. Maybe I can actually push back against what the police officer and the toxicologist on the stand were telling me. So you need to really have an understanding of what's going on with DUI now, what the science actually says. Actually, read the studies. We make all of our studies available. I have yet to see a study from the no side that says that there is no correlation between active THC and an increased risk of accident. There is. Whether or not that level needs to be changed at some point as more science comes available, we can talk about that. But at this point, the peer-reviewed science tells us this is a reasonable level, and people are worried about impaired driving, and we need to address that.
I'm gonna let you have the next question, and we're gonna move on to the no on I-502 side. I'm just gonna ask you a similar, no, it's gonna be you. Yeah, why don't you?
I need to respond to this, obviously. I really don't know where to start here. There was a lot of what I would call misinformation, unfortunately, in Ms. Holcomb's answer. The problem here is that Jeff and I are criminal defense attorneys. we are practicing, we are telling you we can't defend you appropriately against this. The whole issue of driving and drug driving is coming. It's a huge problem that's going to be pushed by the Office of National Drug Control Policy. They have a huge program, a huge grant system. They are going to transfer a tremendous amount of the money that went into the war on drugs. They're going to transfer it into a war on drugged driving, okay? And you are going to have a big push made for these per se strict liability standards across the country. We need to push back against this. This is pandering to people's fears on the lowest possible level. The science on this was examined by the Colorado legislature and a special work group 3 times. Sean McAllister and a lot of other attorneys that I worked with presented the most cutting edge evidence about drug driving and marijuana. They rejected the 5 nanogram standard, not once, not twice, but 3 times. They looked at the science on this. When this bill was before the legislature, Amy Friedheim, who is one of the finest prosecutors in this state on DUIs and vehicular homicides and vehicular assaults, she testified at the legislature against this standard. A prosecutor testified against this standard and said, we should have to prove impairment. We should not affect sober drivers. The science that's being referred to here about increased crash risk after 5 nanograms is one study. The author of that study, when asked in Colorado by the work group, said if he had to pick a number, if they put a gun to his head, it would be 25 or more to protect sober drivers, to protect patients, to protect other people. This standard is ridiculously low. It is not supported by science. We are talking about imposing a standard here when the science is incomplete in its infancy because the United States government's ban on marijuana research has prevented us from doing meaningful research on this. You don't impose standards like this that are going to affect a whole bunch of people without having a scientific basis. Without having a sense that, yes, there's going to be justice here. We say in this country, we're going to let 10 guilty people go free, rather than convict 1 innocent man. We ain't doing too good lately, but we need to get back to that concept. And getting rid of stuff like this is a start. When we talk about zero tolerance for kids, I'm not mistaken about how the DUI laws work. I'm not mistaken about how the criminal justice system works after 21 years as a practicing criminal defense attorney. Mr. Steinborn, after 40 plus years, isn't mistaken about how the criminal justice system works either. And we're telling you how this is going to work. It's not. And that's the problem. It's not going to work for you. It's not going to work for anybody. We talked about the blood draws, little problems here, factual problems. The law changed August 1st in this state. Officers can draw your blood, and they're going to be trained to do that so that they can do it at the side of the road. Now they are taking people to the hospital, but they're training groups to do it at the side of the road. They're training officers to be phlebotomists right now. Like the idea of having your blood drawn while traffic's whizzing by at 60 miles an hour, get used to it, it's coming. You know what else they've got? And I've held them in my hand, so don't tell me they're not coming. They are mouth swabs for THC that will indicate plus or minus 4 or 5 nanograms in your mouth. They've got them, I've seen them, I used them at the debate at Whidbey Island. I held them up. I don't have any here, but they're there, and this technology's coming. This law, they're telling you, okay, this is just a start. We'll pass this, then we'll fix it, it'll get better. Horseshit. Have you ever seen a DUI law get better? Have you ever seen a criminal law in this country anywhere get better? No. They don't lower standards. You don't see headlines like, "Stone driving made easier by legislature." I don't think that's going to happen. And if you know politicians like I know politicians, present company accepted, because this guy's different, but if you know politicians like I know politicians, they will tell you any silly shit you want to hear. And that is what is happening now. That is what is happening with this campaign, and you gotta read this stuff. If you read it, you'll see. You know, strict liability is not something where we can go in and make arguments to the jury and all this other kind of stuff. No. Strict liability is why she was talking about a guy sitting in prison. You know why he's there? Because he had any detectable amount of blood in his system when he was involved in an injury accident. And it was THC in this case, but we already have strict liability that has produced disastrous results in vehicular homicides where people are completely not at fault. Everybody agrees they're not at fault. Amy Friedheim will tell me your client is not at fault, but Douglas, he has to go to prison because of the strict per se law, because I can't defend him, and there's no way out. That's what per se laws do to you. You can't, don't tell me about probable cause, because probable cause doesn't protect you in this country anymore. They gave away the Fourth Amendment a long time ago, and we're fighting to get it back. When you can't overcome stuff like this, don't saddle us with another thing like this that we gotta fight out from under of. We can't.
Thank you. Well, we're gonna move on to another issue, but like everyone said, it's up to everyone to educate themselves. And I just want to say on a personal level and make it a clear part of this discussion, well, we can talk about what the appropriate way to address impaired driving is, and we should. Impaired driving is wrong, and everyone here should understand that getting behind the wheel impaired on any substance is wrong and is dangerous. And so that is just something I think we really need to make clear. Now, moving on, the next place, as we said, where the rubber meets the road, and I'll ask Mr. Holmes to start addressing this, is federal law and the federal government. What is their reaction going to be if I-502 passes? On the one hand, I don't think that we change the law without challenging it. And on the other hand, I think people in the state need to have a clear idea as best as possible what will happen if this law does pass. So I'll let you start, and then perhaps we'll hear from Mr. Steinborn.
Thanks. I think it's good to preface my remarks with just a comment that a lot of what we've heard for the anti-502 argument are predictions. They're rather dire predictions about what others are going to do, what police are going to do, and the like. And frankly, I'm not a very good mind reader. I recognize that as frankly a fear tactic. The same fears that have kept marijuana in prohibition land all this time. It's just ironic that it's coming from the other side. So the truth is, I have no idea. I don't know that Eric Holder knows what he's going to do if 502 passes, when it passes. I do know that this bill was drafted very carefully to make it preemption proof. It creates no direct conflict, and we can make predictions about what the IRS is going to do, but there is no reason to say that that is absolutely going to happen, because Mr. Steinborn cannot predict the future any more than I can. I cannot predict what Jenny Durkin, Eric Holder will do, but I can say that I would welcome a court challenge. In fact, that would probably be a chance where we could advance this argument beyond the cheers and clapping and actually take it into a court and get a decision where it really matters. This is serious stuff, folks. This bill was drafted to avoid the federal preemption argument. But we are still trying to deal with the problem of federal preemption. And so let's not confuse the two issues. You will hear a lot of stuff talking about federal supremacy and the federal law. Yes, it will still be illegal under federal law to open a store, sell marijuana, produce marijuana, and process marijuana. And you will still be subject to federal prosecution. But it is highly unlikely, it would be unprecedented that any state official under this bill would be prosecuted by the federal government. It would be highly unlikely that we're going to see that court ruling granting that injunction, especially given that we have a one-year rulemaking period where even the federal government can come and participate. So I think, I'm just going to be honest with you, I can't predict what they will do. If they file a lawsuit, if they then take criminal enforcement against individuals, that could happen. But this bill is the best exercise of state authority that was reserved under the Constitution that we've seen to date. It's one that deserves an opportunity because it is so comprehensive and is so responsible and is trying to at least address the problem of stone driving and youth having access to marijuana. That is the bill that is going to be the hardest for a federal government to attack politically, let alone legally. That's why 502 has been drafted the way it's been drafted. The other thing I just want to, I'll close with this just as an aside, that, you know, 502 will provide immediate, it will give you arrest protection. That's something that we don't have right now. Second, I think that we've tended here to just brush over real quickly this whole THC issue, and it's important that everyone here really understand what they're talking about. When they say this shows up in your bloodstream forever, make sure you have an intelligent conversation with people. Are you talking about carboxy THC or active THC? And see if they give a puzzled look, because it's all the difference in the world. 502 is going to improve the law in Washington by insisting that it's active THC that we measure, not carboxy, because people are going to jail now with carboxy tests, which do indeed show lingering marijuana, THC in your bloodstream a long time after usage. But this is specifying active THC. So there are real life improvements in every medical marijuana user, every recreational user in 502 that will become effective 30 days after the ballot. 30 days, this year. Real arrest protection. You don't have it now. So the federal government, I'll just come back again. We will engage them. My guess is that they will actually, after the ballot, respect the vote of the citizens of Washington. They will want to sit down and talk with law enforcement and legal minds, and we can chuckle all we want about this, but I think that serious officials will want to sit down and talk about what if. I don't think that they will shoot first and aim later. I actually think they will want to discuss, now that this is passed, how can it further law enforcement goals, for instance, of shutting down that I-5 drug corridor.
I'm going to just follow up real quickly, and then we'll let Mr. Steinborn respond. But I thought also perhaps you could let people know from your perspective how the state government looks forward or not to implementing this.
Sure. You know, we have races going on the same ballot for governor and for attorney general. It so happens all of them are opposed to legalization. Just legalization, because it's a scary issue. That should be an indicator to you when Inslee and Ferguson are also afraid of legalization, just how close the public is on this and how tenuous this vote can be. But they have also all stated that they will certainly enforce the right of the voters. The will of the voters. Ferguson has told me that, you know, of course he will defend the law. If the voters pass 502, he will work hard to protect it and to guard it against any federal or other attack. So I envision the day after passage, we start to assemble the working groups. I would hope that the legal talent here at this table would be sitting there talking about how we can make this work. And I think that that's what will happen before you see any legal action, any enforcement action. There will be serious, high-level discussions about how this could be implemented in a way that furthers public safety goals.
Well, we got a couple subjects here. First is federal preemption. I use a different word. I use federal trumping. Preemption is kind of a sophisticated legal concept, and I'm not even sure I understand it. But the question is, are the feds going to let us do this? And if not, what are they going to do about it? Now, when we tried to pass a law that really is very similar to, when the legislature passed the law, the medical marijuana law, that would have had the state involved in regulating, licensing, the manufacture, distribution of medical marijuana. Medical marijuana is a lot more popular than recreational, mind you. When our state wanted to do that, our governor wrote a letter to the Attorney General, and one day later, the Attorney General wrote back saying, if you do this, every state official who participates will be subject to the full spectrum of civil and criminal sanctions. They didn't say we will sanction them, but there it is. They'll be subject to them. Now, we pretty much all know that our U.S. attorney does not want to get involved in medical marijuana. I'm sure if she had her druthers, she would let the states figure it out and the local governments figure it out like these folks want to do, and if the feds get out of the way, we might get ourselves a pretty decent regulation. But the feds threatened that one, and in one day the governor folded and vetoed every single part of the bill that would involve any state officials. Okay, nobody's ever prosecuted a state official before, and maybe they won't. But if you got a cushy state job with benefits and retirement, are you going to risk prosecution? Do you want to have somebody pass a law that throws you in the face of the feds to see if they're going to bite your head off or merely send you a letter? I don't think that's very wise legislation, and that's what's wrong with it. They said they'll do it, and they will. Now, there have been some statements made by some people that the feds are honoring local laws, local medical marijuana laws. Now, it's just not true. They're not. The feds say, well, we only prosecute the ones that are not in compliance with state law. Well, that's a nice cover, but the truth is that the local authorities have been behind many of these places that have been prosecuted, and there are people in prison, people in jail. Somebody just died in Montana. The feds are just not going to ignore this. They're going to do something about it. They have no choice until the Controlled Substances Act is changed. So let me leave it at that. Pete talked a little bit about arrest protection. I thought I made that pretty clear. There's no arrest protection. You're just not going to be arrested for possession. You're going to be arrested for DWI, a much more serious crime and harder to disprove. I'm going to surrender to Douglas here for a minute. I think he's got something he wants to say about this. Alison, you're next. Who wants to be clean up here?
Okay.
No, go ahead, Douglas. I think it's fair.
How do you do CBD? How do you do those?
Sorry.
Hold on. You got to write a question down to somebody. I'd be happy to take questions. You know, I'll talk to anybody who wants to talk to me. Crazy enough afterwards. At any rate, the federal issue here is one, of course, that burns me up, right? You can look at an initiative at sensiblewashington.org. If you want to look at an initiative that was carefully drafted to avoid federal preemption, I suggest you look at the initiative that Sensible Washington drafted at sensiblewashington.org. Jeff Steinborn, myself, and a whole bunch of other lawyers spent a lot of time crafting something that we believe is preemption-proof and can force the federal government to make changes, and is a historical copy of what we did in 1932 when we repealed the Bone Dry Act in this state by initiative and made it stick, as a lot of other states did, and we made the federal government change. That's the constitutional process we need to take forward to make and guarantee real change, period. 502 is imminently, instantly, easily preemptible, and if we have the misfortune to have it pass, it will be injuncted by the federal government. They are sending out letters shutting down medical marijuana dispensaries that are legally defensible under state law. They are federalizing the medical marijuana prosecutions in eastern Washington and in other states like Montana, where Richard Ford just died. The man is dead because of this, because of medical marijuana prosecution by the federal government, legal under state law, and now a man is dead and his wife is in prison and can't even bury the guy. That is what's wrong, and that is what your federal government is going to do. Somebody said there's room for us to do this under federal law. They're not giving us an inch of breathing space. The boot is on our neck, and anything that has regulations in it, which they say you gotta have to pass, is going to be preempted, preemptible, injuncted. There are not gonna be any high-level discussions. There's gonna be a trip to federal court. It's gonna be short and sweet. And then, if the federal government construes this thing, like a lot of legal experts think they will, we will be left with 1 ounce decrimmed, nowhere legal to get it, and a couple of really bad amendments to the DUI law. And that'll be what your initiative actually delivers to you when the federal dust settles. If we somehow got really lucky, the federal judge would strike the whole goddamn thing. But that probably wouldn't happen. So that is probably what's going to happen. And I got no crystal ball, but when the federal government goes into a city council meeting in Northern California and threatens the county commissioners, I can't understand why anybody would think that they're going to leave a legalization initiative that's completely preemptible on the books in Washington State. Because if anybody believes that, I need you to share with me whatever you're smoking, please.
That is only in the outdoor area.
So, Douglas brought up Richard Floor, who did very tragically die in federal prison in Montana under our current laws. One of my client's patients, my client was charged with growing marijuana, forced to plead guilty to a felony in state court or face federal charges for growing marijuana for medical purposes. And her patient died on the day that she pled guilty to felony charges in state court because all of the medication had been seized. That's happening under current state law. Jeff Steinborn represented a man who killed himself before going to serve a federal sentence. That's happening under current laws. You vote 502 down, you vote for continuation of current marijuana laws. On the federal issue, yes, Governor Gregoire vetoed the regulatory provisions of Senate Bill 5073 last year. You can't veto an initiative. There are 17 states now and Washington, D.C. that have medical marijuana laws passed by the voters and the state legislators in those states. Half of those, which do not include Washington, do not include Montana, do not include California, but other medical marijuana states have licensing and regulation of production and distribution of marijuana. The federal government has never once taken any of those states to court to try to overturn the licensing and regulation of production and distribution of marijuana. In fact, when Governor Jan Brewer challenged Arizona's medical marijuana law and argued preemption, the United States Department of Justice successfully brought a motion to dismiss the case, arguing, we have never challenged or never threatened any state employee with arrest and prosecution for the implementation of a state's medical marijuana law. Now, we can't say what the federal government will do with respect to 502, but we can look at facts. We can stop imagining the worst case scenario is inevitable. We can look at the fact that obviously the federal government is paying attention to the political support for medical marijuana and the fact that states are passing medical marijuana laws. What if we tell the federal government that the states are now ready to legalize marijuana for all adults, regardless of medical use? That is not something the federal government can ignore. And I agree with Heatt. If they decide that they're going to bring a legal challenge, then let's have the legal challenge. But let's not pretend that if we vote 502 down, that all of a sudden the laws are magically going to get better, because the federal government is going to say, see, even when you put the most conservative proposal to legalize marijuana in front of the voters of the state, they're not ready for it. They don't want to legalize marijuana. And the federal government is not going to all of a sudden say, oh, the reason why they didn't pass 502 was because it didn't go far enough. So we better go ahead and change federal law to let the states go ahead and legalize marijuana. That is what's not happening. So this is what 502 represents, is an opportunity for us to join Colorado and Oregon, hopefully, to send the message, like we have with medical marijuana, that the states are ready to go in a new direction. We've got to start the ball rolling. But we started the medical marijuana ball rolling in 1996, and 17 states plus DC is pretty good. But this is going to be a long haul. There's still going to be a lot of work to get done, but we're not going to get there unless we take the first step. And 502 represents a really important first step.
I just want to add to it. Perhaps it's because we are looking at this just a little bit too much from the defense attorney's perspective, I mean, I think we got to also recognize
I wish
Alison.
that were true.
Alison has experience in as well, and hey, I'm just the prosecutor. So, but maybe we need to stop thinking about that and remember one other lesson, and that is with alcohol prohibition. The way the 18th Amendment was finally repealed, a political process, was after 22 states, including Washington, said, screw the 18th Amendment, we're going to legalize and regulate alcohol. They went ahead and took that step in spite of a constitutional amendment outlawing alcohol. Right now, federal law is not, that we're talking about controlling drugs, is not constitutional. We're talking about being one of the first 3 states to send a strong message to Washington, D.C. That's political. That's really what is important in this case, and we need to just keep that in mind. What a loss in Washington or California, like California or Oregon or Colorado, is going to be for this movement.
Pete, you're absolutely right about how we got rid of prohibition, but as you may recall, we got prohibition with an initiative that was very much like the Sensible Washington initiative from a couple of years ago, which was we simply, in a couple of sentences, repealed all criminal penalties for alcohol for adults, period. The feds can't trump that. And if you're afraid of the wild, wild west, unregulated marijuana, and you haven't paid much attention to what's happening in Seattle, we already got that, and you know, the world hasn't stopped spinning. A little regulation might be a good thing, but we know it's not going to explode on us like plutonium. So that's my answer to that. Yes, look at the history, look at prohibition, how we dumped it. That's how we dumped it. We simply tricked the feds by sticking it back in their faces by eliminating all state criminal penalties.
I just want to briefly respond to that because Jeff is absolutely right. From a legal perspective, the proposal by Sensible Washington to repeal all state laws regarding criminal or civil penalties for marijuana, we could do that and the feds could do absolutely nothing about it because the feds can't make a state make something a crime. Absolutely right from a legal perspective. The problem with the analogy is that there's a massive cultural difference between alcohol and marijuana. We were a nation of drunkards. Alcohol was a huge part of our culture before Prohibition happened. And we knew what a commercial alcohol market looked like. We knew about saloons, we knew about beer manufacturers, we knew about whiskey manufacturers. So it was not so scary, and we liked to drink a lot. It was not so scary to repeal alcohol prohibition. Marijuana doesn't enjoy that same position in our culture, and in fact, the Washington state voters, you ask them how they feel about marijuana, consistently, less than 1/3 of Washington state voters have positive feelings about marijuana. The trick is that the needle that we're threading here is people that agree that our current marijuana prohibition isn't working, but they aren't particularly fond of marijuana. And Sensible Washington knows from its own polling, their ballot title polled miserably. 34% one time around, 42% another time around. It's a political question. Voters simply aren't ready to do a full repeal of marijuana laws the way that they were incensed about the alcohol prohibition and were willing to do a full repeal of alcohol prohibition. That's why 502 is drafted to address the concerns that keep people from being willing to take this step. And furthermore, Sensible Washington is saying, on the one hand, we're going to repeal it all, but we expect that the legislature is going to come in and implement the regulations for us. Well, that's just as preemptible as doing it all in one fell swoop with one initiative. So there's really no point in splitting the baby that way.
Actually, there's a huge point in splitting the baby that way. and basically the huge point is that the way alcohol prohibition got repealed in this state and many others, and the reason why Sensible Washington, Jeff and I and a whole bunch of other lawyers drafted it this way was we'd seen what happened. When you repeal and you take all of the laws making it criminal out of the state law, the federal government is powerless to do anything. They cannot touch you. Then, in a separate instrument, you go and you get the regulations passed by the legislature. When the legislature, and this is exactly what happened with alcohol in this state, we did it 2 years later, so we had the Wild West for 2 years. Apparently we're still all here. But anyway, Then the legislature does your regulations. There's a real good reason why the federal government doesn't come in and preempt those regulations, because they would look like idiots. They can't say, we just told you this is the most dangerous thing in the world, like they did with alcohol, but now we're going to take away all of your controls on it. They were forced with a fait accompli. Once we take it out of the state law and there's no way for the state to prosecute anybody over it, the feds have to live with it. That's what forced prohibition to end, was they couldn't be seen to be going in and wiping out the very regulations they had been supporting. It was politically impossible. And that's what dawned on me from doing the historical research. So there's a very good reason why that's the way you do it. And I just want to, for just a brief second here, address this cultural thing, and then I'm going to hand the mic to Jeff. But the deal here is, there may be some problems with the cultural thing. It would be surprising if there wasn't, since marijuana has been used as an excuse for racism and every other thing in this country. It's driven a lot of our problems are associated with it. But there's one really great antidote to all of that federal government propaganda and lying that's been going on for 70 years or so. There's one thing that really gets rid of that and clears the air and cleans the room. And you know what that is? Telling the truth will do it. If you tell the truth, there's no driving problem. There's no problem growing hemp. There's no problem with recreational use. There's no problem with kids. You tell the goddamn truth. You don't pander and lie.
I gotta follow that. Yeah, no. You know, what we've been talking about brings us to what I think is a fundamental difference between the pragmatists on my right, who are very successful, and I commend what they're doing, and I think us idealists over here on the left, and it is this. Clearly, some of the provisions in 502 were designed to address what the polls told them, to appease the fears, to lure in those who couldn't be lured in, but the way they chose to do this, in my opinion, appeals to ignorance and fear. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but it's my belief that in America, that we can also succeed by appealing to the beauty of the human spirit and their desires and ideals and dreams, rather than their fears. Now, I've never been elected, so maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I'm hanging on to.
Well, if you've ever been in court, you know that the defendant usually gets the last word, but we're going to let the prosecutor have the last word today. And I'm going to speak just a minute after, but please.
As Jeff, I think everyone here knows, I'm pretty darn idealistic myself. I really do care about making change. That's why I love this job. I wake up every day just really grateful that I have a chance to come and serve the city of Seattle, and moreover, to help us to be a model for the rest of the country, if not the rest of the state. And I have to come back to the fact, though, that it is what's practically possible. You can call that a compromise if you want. You can call that a selling out if you want. But I beg to differ. I've taken real stands that have, involved some bleeding on my part. If you think, again, just simply saying you're not going to prosecute possession cases is an easy thing to do, and even in Seattle, you're just mistaken. And if you don't think that this is going to go backwards on us if we vote no on 502, I think you're just very, very much mistaken. This is a chance to send a strong message. It's an effort to show the federal government that they don't have the last word, and it was an effort done to bring something that is really possible to the voters and get their assent. We can talk in theory about preemption and why Sensible Washington has a better initiative, but if it doesn't make it to the ballot, what's the point? You have a real ballot measure now that can pass this year. You can have legalization this December. You can have a process put in place where we're actually having adult conversations with the federal government about